So Aristotle says people will naturally come together to form a government where they will cooperate, but the purpose of their government is to provide a space where its people can live a good life, and that's something that people will naturally want to do. So Hobbes was against at least this version of Aristotelianism. He was against, at the time, it was a combination of Aristotle and a lot of Catholic doctrines, and this was called scholasticism, and Hobbes says this is an incorrect starting point. So actually I'm going to note, as an end point, the idea that we have shared ethics is not actually at odds with Hobbes, but as a starting point, Hobbes says people are fundamentally different. They don't necessarily have, there's no fixed reason why they have shared ethics as a starting point, so this whole theory is incorrect, and we can't just count upon people wanting to build a nice city-state to live in. We need a much more robust theory of what they want to do. Just in terms of, as I said, Hobbes doesn't like scholastic Aristotelianism, so here's some criticisms of it. He says, well, it's based on metaphysics, he says, and the metaphysics which was taught at the time, and this is largely Aristotle, involves a lot of definitions like form, matter, essence, subject, art, quantity. And these are all taught from Aristotle's metaphysics. And this was a bit of Aristotle he didn't like, the metaphysics. Indeed, he says, on the metaphysics, of that which is there written, for the most part, it is so far from the possibility of being understood, as well as so repugnant to natural reason, that whoever thinketh there is anything to understand by it must needs think it supernatural. And it's the combination of that with supernatural teachings of Catholicism he didn't like. And he criticizes the universities as well. He says that because in the universities the authority of Aristotle is only current there, in other words, they only teach Aristotle, the thing which they teach there is not properly philosophy, but Aristotelism. He says it would be much better. I said he likes geometry. As for geometry, he wishes this was taught more. Till of very late times it had no place in the universities at all. And if a man had attained any degree of perfection in geometry, he was commonly thought a magician, and his art diabolical. So I quite like this as having a physics degree. I quite like the idea of being thought a magician who could only have learned geometry by some sort of diabolic pact. Plato, Hobbes did quite like. He was the best of the Greek philosophers because Plato only accepted students who had some basic understanding of geometry into his academy. That was a starting point. You had to be able to do geometry. And Hobbes likes this. Okay. So that's the background. He says we'll replace this theory with something more scientific. A contemporary guy with quite similar thinking to Hobbes is Machiavelli, slightly older. The difference between them, well, the similarity, both of them assume humans are essentially self-interested. The difference between them is Hobbes is basically a scientist. And as a natural philosopher, he tries to take a logical approach. He asks, fundamentally, can we break down people into their elements? And then can we take what's called a resolutive compositive approach? Once we've worked out the fundamental nature of the different bits which make people go, can we then do composition? Can we then put those together and predict how they will behave and what sort of governments they can form? It's a quite logical, scientific, or even game theoretical approach to understanding people. So in comparison, so Hobbes is really asking, how do we get morality out of nothing or out of materialism, but at least we can rely on the fact that people are able to use reason, to use logical thinking. So that's what Hobbes is asking. Machiavelli is a bureaucrat. He doesn't care about logical reasoning at all. Don't know how much bureaucracy you've come across, but this is correct. And Machiavelli draws his conclusions from observations and historical knowledge, but certainly not from this kind of reductive and then reconstructive reasoning. Machiavelli's question is really, well, I know that people are moral in their private lives, but nonetheless, when they run governments, they're not particularly moral. They should be amoral, in fact. And so Machiavelli asks, how does amoral leadership come about from people who are moral? Oh, but something he's willing to add, they're definitely not rational. They definitely don't think logically. Nonetheless, both of them are basically quite cynical about people, and that's the contemporary tone of thinking about people at the time, probably driven by the number of civil wars they lived through. And both of them write, at least in modern translation, pretty challenging stuff to read, in my opinion. Okay. So that's enough background. Okay. So Hobbes Leviathan is divided into 4 parts. So one part of it is this materialist and cynical theory about people. So that's this chunk 1, which talks about how do these properties of people bring about what he calls the state of nature, and from the state of nature, what are the laws of nature? How do governments come to be produced, and how should they be constructed? Then he talks a bit about what is the actual structure or makeup of governments, and he talks about, after that, the relation of the church to the state, and a bit of the universities to the state. And then my favourite part, the 4th part, which is pretty short, is on the kingdom of darkness. So this is bad ideas. This is what not to do in constructing a state. But he gives plenty of examples of how it has been done. One of his examples I quite like is the overuse of Greek. You shouldn't use these Greek philosophy books. They're rubbish. You should use mine instead, he says. Okay, so that background. Let's go through fairly quickly these ideas as far as I understood them when I was reading them on the beach. And how well I understood them is going to have varied depending on what time of day it was, because there was a bar. So, of sense. So this is how, but it's going to go up and down, basically. So theory of human nature and knowledge. So, as I said, he's an empiricist. He says thoughts are representations in the mind. So when you look at the rain outside, actually the thing which you're experiencing in your mind is the representation of the rain. So you're effectively imagining it to yourself based on how your brain is being stimulated by the influence coming in from your eyes. So he says the origin of all of these thoughts, he says, what I just said, are sense. So that's no conception in your mind. This picture we've imagined of the rain exists, which is not at first, totally or by parts, begotten by the organs of sense. Everything else in your mind is derived from that original. So he's an empiricist. Kant improves on this so that he separates what can be learned empirically from what can be learned rationally, and says it's only in the synthesis of the two that you have anything sensible. But Hobbes is a hard empiricist. He says he's not quite, I don't think he wrote tabula rasa, I think that's Locke, but he says that everything that we learn comes from our experience of the world around us, and that's quite important. Sense is in all cases caused by the pressure or motion of external things upon our eyes, ears, etc. So from that starting point, he then deduces, more or less, other properties of the human brain, so about imagination, and he has an interesting conclusion that imagination, in some way you are actually just imagining in your mind the rain outside, which is now gone, and he says that there's imagination and there's memory, which is the same thing as imagination. Both of them are simply the lingering relics of the impression left on your mind by the experience coming in of seeing the sight from the raindrops outside. So he deductively builds up the properties of the mind, so sense, memory, and then he builds up to speech, reason, and logical thinking, and he builds up to preferences. So this is core. So preferences or passions is the chapter title. So in other words, what things do you prefer? The point is that because people have had different experiences, they all have slightly different preferences. And different preferences means they have different morality. That's quite important. And then he's got this chapter 9, which has it, and it's a good job he stops talking about people at this point, because chapter 9 involves this unintelligible diagram of types of knowledge. And in this diagram of types of knowledge, physics is one of the top one, and it subdivides into a lot of things, including geography, which I think is, and astrology. Whereas something else divides into astronomy, which is not even in the physics path, I think. And optics is definitely not a part of physics. Logic is definitely not a part of physics. In fact, yeah, astronomy and cosmography, not even on the physics branch of the tree. So this is rubbish, but it's an attempt to describe all of the properties of the mind. You only need to go as far as preferences, in my opinion, anyway. And then after that chapter, he changes subject wisely. Key concept: unique life experiences. People have different preferences. Okay. This leads to the Hobbesian state of nature. So then, given you've got these different people, what are they like in this, when there's no authority? State of nature means no authority. So I've got to come up with a couple of ways to describe this. So a state of, if you're going on a cruise past some islands, and you fall off the back of the cruise ship for some reason, and you wash up on the island, this is a starting point for a state of nature. And so you might go and harvest some coconuts that you find, and you might start constructing a still to make yourself some booze so that you can enjoy your life on the desert island. And the problem of the state of nature is that at this point you discover you're not alone on the island, and you're pretty sure someone on the other side of the island, there's someone else there, and they're a cannibal, and they don't speak your language. And so you stop constructing your still, and you get deadlocked into a sort of competition with the other person on the island. It's even worse than that. You then come to decide there's lots of different cannibals, and they all come from different islands, and none of them speak each other's language, and they're all out to get you. This is the state of nature, because there's no authority controlling the different people on the island. And the problem with this is you can't devote your time usefully to the construction of the still for manufacturing what you really want to enjoy, the booze, because you have to dedicate all of your time to constructing basic weapons in order to fight off the cannibals. And this is an unfortunate situation. This leads to a situation where it's possible no building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's what it's like on the cannibal island, where there's the state of nature. This is a very, very bad thing, which he deduces from materialism, should come about. So that's my story. His story is a bit more deductively worked out than that. He has these more logical steps in which he says, men by nature equal. I won't give you the long quote on that. Essentially, yes, some people might be a bit stronger than one another, somebody else might be a bit quicker of thinking, somebody else might have better aim with a spear or something, but essentially, no person is so universally better at everything that they could be completely immune from worrying about the cannibal on the other side of the island. This means they get stuck in diffidence, or I think this means competition. They get deadlocked into building basic weapons, and this leads to civil war, or there is the bellum omnia contra omnes, the state of war of all against all. That's roughly what I was trying to describe on the island. And then there are the incommodities, or the unfortunateness of this state is this thing, which is really bad and much to be avoided. If you don't believe this, it comes to the end of this chapter. This is one of the best chapters. If you don't believe that people are that bad when they wash up on a desert island, ask yourself some questions. Questions. Do you lock your doors at night? Very wise. Yeah, I know. I'm going to find something that you do, but it's going to take time. If you're at a cafe, would you leave your belongings on the table? No. Okay, very good. If you go abroad, would you travel alone? I wouldn't. Actually, no, I did. But I went to Crete, so that's... But anyway, that was very nice. One other example. Do you arm yourself when you take a long journey? Yeah, okay, that's a 17th century example. So the point is, you do take, at least lots of these things, you do take precautions against your fellow man, and this in a fully, pretty much 100% functioning 21st century state. So that just indicates that you can abstract from that in the absence of authority. And so this is a functioning state with police and law courts. In the absence of this kind of authority, how much more obviously would people be in this unfortunate war of all against all? And that's the low point. That's the worst possible case. And then Hobbes works out how we get out of this and how we construct a government. But first of all, he justifies that the state of nature is this. It's quite different from later, more optimistic views about people. But why not? So from the state of nature and some of the previous chapters, Hobbes then deduces the first and second laws of nature. So these are not physical laws. These are deducible principles about how we should set up our government. Now, so far from his chapter, and roughly this description of Cannibal Island, he's worked out that humans have liberty. In liberty, you've washed up, every man has the right to everything. So that on this island, there are the coconut trees on the island, and everyone has the right to go and collect the coconuts. Okay? And he's also worked out from his chapter on preferences or desires, everyone should wish to preserve themselves. That means not get hurt. So everyone should wish to survive and prosper and be able to build that still for producing the coconut liquor. So that's principles A and B. I did do some equation numbering. And from that, from B, really, he says, first law of nature, in order to survive and prosper, everyone should seek for themselves peace, this lack of civil war. And then taking together B with the taking together C, that everyone ought to seek peace with this concept of liberty in the state of nature, he then deduces, okay, so in that case, you should be willing, when others are also willing to do so, so far as for peace you consider necessary, you should be willing to lay down the right of some of those things which you had the right to, and then be contented with so much liberty against other men as you would allow other men against yourself. So this is actually quite a lot of better situation than we were in the state of nature, because at this point Hobbes has deduced the golden rule of morality. So that is basically do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. He's managed to deduce that from hardcore materialism and no theological principles at all. So he's made some progress there, and at this point seems to be actually endorsing quite a good thing. So those are the laws of nature, or the principles which should be followed. And a lot of the rest of the book works out how do you then implement those principles. Again, it's going to get a bit worse, and then it's going to get a bit better once you've got these principles. Okay.